April 7th, 1945. Tokyo Bay, Empire of Japan. Dawn lights up the Japanese islands as 91 North American P-51D Mustangs from the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups near their meeting point. Major James B. Tapp holds the control stick tightly in his Mustang. His aircraft is equipped with 6 wing-mounted .50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, loaded with armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The early P-51D models carry 500 rounds for each inboard gun and 270 for the center and outboard positions, totaling 2,880 rounds. Later models would adjust this to 400 rounds per inboard gun for better reliability, bringing the total to 1,880 rounds. Below, Mount Fuji rises against the clear sky, distinctly majestic. Its snow-capped peak serves as a navigational point for pilots during the mission. The morning sun casts long shadows over the Japanese landscape, showing a patchwork of rice fields, villages, and military bases that have never encountered American fighters before. This mission is groundbreaking. They are tasked with escorting B-29 superfortresses deep into the Japanese homeland from a base 750 miles away. Just 2 years earlier, military planners had considered this distance unachievable for single-engine fighters. At 0700 hours, over 100 Japanese interceptors approach the American formation. Through the morning haze comes a vision that shocks the Japanese pilots to their core. American fighters appear over Tokyo, something their commanders had claimed was impossible. The psychological impact hits hard. These are not carrier-based Navy fighters with limited range. These are land-based Army Air Force fighters that have crossed 750 miles of open ocean to reach the imperial capital. Leading the Japanese defense are pilots in the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, known as the Frank, Japan's fastest and most advanced fighter, alongside older aircraft like the Ki-43 Hayabusas, Ki-44 Shoki, Ki-61 Heian, and the Navy's J-2M0 and N-1K2J Shiden. The Ki-84 has the ability to outclimb and outmaneuver both the P-51 and the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt at certain altitudes and speeds. What unfolds next will highlight the significant technological divide between the two nations' approaches to air warfare. It will also reveal why American industrial power has produced what many pilots would consider the perfect long-range fighter aircraft. The North American P-51D Mustang had come to the Pacific theater with a reputation already established in the skies. Over Europe, where it had decimated the Luftwaffe and made daytime bombing of Germany a reality. Initially developed for export to Britain, the models modified by the British to use Rolls-Royce Merlin engines became America's top wartime fighters. The shift from the early variants powered by Allison engines to the Merlin-powered version marked one of aviation's most successful international partnerships. This collaboration combined American aerodynamic expertise with British engine technology. The legendary Merlin engine, paired with the P-51 Mustang, eventually led to the P-51D. It provided the United States Army Air Forces with a high-performance, high-altitude, long-range fighter capable of escorting heavy bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Remarkably, it could also reach from Iwima to Tokyo and back. The Packard 5th 1657 engine, a licensed version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin 66, delivered 1,695 horsepower at takeoff with water injection. In emergency power settings, it could rise to 1,720 horsepower. This two-stage, two-speed supercharger maintained optimal performance at altitudes where Japanese engines struggled for air. Their single-stage superchargers could not compress the thin atmosphere effectively. The P-51D achieved a top speed of about 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. It could reach an operational ceiling of nearly 42,000 feet and was armed with 6 wing-mounted 0.50-inch M2 Browning machine guns. The firepower statistics were devastating and meticulously calculated. 6 M2 Browning machine guns firing at 800 rounds per minute meant the P-51D delivered 4,800 rounds per minute, which is 80 rounds per second. Each armor-piercing incendiary round weighed 46 grams and traveled at 2,900 feet per second, delivering massive kinetic energy upon impact. These rounds could penetrate aircraft armor, ignite fuel tanks, and destroy engines with just a few well-placed hits. By the end of 1944, 14 out of the 15 fighter squadrons of the United States 8th Air Force in Europe were made up of Mustangs, proving the aircraft's superiority over all other available fighters. This massive production and deployment showcased American industrial capacity at its height, with assembly lines operating around the clock. North American Aviation's factories in Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas, produced P-51s at an astonishing rate. At peak production, a new Mustang came off the assembly line every hour. By the end of the war, 15,586 P-51 Mustangs were built. The D model alone accounted for 8,156 aircraft. This number exceeded Japan's total fighter production in the last 2 years of the war combined. The long-range capabilities of the Mustangs redefined fighter operations and changed the nature of air warfare. With dual drop tanks, these aircraft could routinely fly round trips of 1,500 statute miles. Pilots sometimes pushed this to 1,600 miles when necessary. This distance is like flying from Los Angeles, California, to Little Rock, Arkansas, entirely over water in a single-engine plane, with no backup landing spots except the ocean. The success of this feat was largely due to the Merlin engine's impressive fuel efficiency at cruise settings. It consumed just 65 gallons during economical flight. The P-51's unique laminar flow wing design also played a crucial role. It reduced drag by 35% compared to standard airfoils. Edgar Schmood, an aerodynamicist at North American, designed the laminar flow wing. This design helped maintain smooth airflow over more of the wing's surface. As a result, it delayed the shift to turbulent flow and greatly lowered parasitic drag. In stark contrast, the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate entered service with the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service in June 1944. However, it arrived too late and in insufficient numbers to impact the war. Known as Gale and called Frank by the Allies, this fighter was Japan's desperate attempt to compete with American technology. The Ki-84 is often considered the best Japanese fighter that operated in large numbers during the conflict. However, what Japan deemed mass production would be viewed as prototype runs by America. The aircraft had high speed and excellent maneuverability. It was armed with up to 230mm Ho-155 cannons and 220mm Ho-5 cannons, giving it powerful firepower. Yet, the reality was more complicated. The 30mm cannons held only 50 rounds each. The 20mm cannons carried just 150 rounds each, totaling only 400 rounds. In comparison, the Mustangs had an ammunition load of 1,880 to 2,800 rounds. On paper, the Ki-84 looked competitive, even superior in some respects. It was powered by the Nakajima Ha-45, a complex 18-cylinder radial engine. The aircraft featured fuel injection and a single-stage 2-speed supercharger. It utilized water methanol injection to boost performance, giving the Ki-84 a rated 2,000 horsepower at takeoff. Initial tests produced promising results. Prototypes hit speeds of 387 miles per hour in level flight. Later claims suggested speeds of up to 427 miles per hour under optimal conditions, using high-octane fuel and precise engine tuning. However, the reality of late-war Japanese production told a different story. It was marked by declining quality, desperate improvisation, and systemic failure. Pilots and crews had to be cautious with the high-maintenance Nakajima Hamar engine. The landing gear was prone to buckling at the worst possible times. While the Hamar engine was theoretically powerful and advanced, it had chronic reliability issues that worsened as quality control faltered. The engine required tight tolerances, which Japanese factories, under constant bombardment from the B-29 Superfortress and lacking quality materials, could not maintain. Many landing gear systems suffered because of the poor heat treatment of late-war Japanese steel. This steel often contained impurities that made proper hardening impossible. Consequently, many Hayatas faced strut collapses during landings. This led to the loss of aircraft that Japan could ill afford and the deaths of pilots who underwent months of training. The disparity in production quality highlighted Japan's broader industrial crisis. The country had gambled everything on a quick victory and faced defeat instead. In contrast, American factories upheld consistent quality standards even with massive production volumes. They actually improved the quality as production techniques evolved. Meanwhile, Japanese manufacturing deteriorated rapidly. The decline in quality control meant that pilots could never be sure how each aircraft would perform. They often questioned whether the brakes would function, if the engine would hold under high power, or if they could climb high enough to intercept B-29 superfortresses cruising at 30,000 feet. By 1945, Japan had produced only 3,514 Ki-84 aircraft in total. Many of these were grounded due to shortages of spare parts, fuel, or qualified pilots. Of those that remained operational, perhaps half were truly combat-ready at any given moment. The fuel crisis underscored the strategic disaster facing Japan, a nation that entered the war partly to secure oil resources. Pilots used 100-octane aviation gasoline transported from refineries in Texas and California. This fuel was specially designed for high-performance engines. In contrast, Japanese pilots relied on whatever fuel they could produce domestically or create from coal. Late in the war, Japanese aviation fuel often had an octane rating of 87 or even lower, sometimes dipping to 80. This compromised engine power and led to pre-ignition, which damaged cylinders, pistons, and valves. Some desperate units tried to mix their fuel with oil from pine roots, alcohol made from sweet potatoes, and even byproducts from sock production. This further harmed engine performance and dependability. Pilots reported engines that barely started, ran roughly at all power levels, and frequently failed during flight. On the mission of April 7th, the Mustangs gathered with their charges. They escorted 103 Boeing B-29 superfortresses from the 73rd Bomb Wing. Each of these bombers carried tons of incendiary bombs aimed at Japanese industrial sites. Captain Art Bridge from the 45th Fighter Squadron remembered, "It was a real spectacle." The B-29s were just finishing their assembly in a grand circle as we arrived. The sun glinted off their aluminum skin. They looked like a school of giant silver fish swimming through the sky. The meeting itself was a success in navigation and planning, made possible by American technological advantages. The P-51s flew 750 miles over open ocean. They primarily navigated by dead reckoning and basic radio compass, coordinating their arrival to match the bomber's schedule within minutes. They climbed gradually from sea level to 25,000 feet. Their engines automatically adjusted the fuel mixture as they ascended, and their superchargers seamlessly switched from low to high gear to maintain power. Upon crossing the coast of Honshu, the P-51 pilots discarded their 110-gallon auxiliary wing tanks as they spotted the first frontal attacks from over 100 Japanese interceptors taking off from various airfields near Tokyo. The silver drop tanks fell to earth, shining in the morning sun. Some exploded upon impact, while others rolled across rice paddies. The Japanese pilots, flying a mix of K-84s, K-43s, K-44s, K-61s, and Navy fighters, including Zeros and the new N-1K2J Shidenkai, felt their first shock. These were not Navy carrier fighters with limited range. Land-based fighters had somehow made it back to Japan from bases that felt impossibly far away. Flight Sergeant Totanamizu, flying a Ki-84 with the 56 Centi, later shared his disbelief. When we were ordered to scramble, we were told enemy fighters were approaching Tokyo. We assumed it was a mistake. Maybe they meant enemy bombers. When I saw the Mustangs, I thought I was dreaming. It seemed impossible. Our commanders had promised us that no American fighter could reach Japan from their island bases. Yet here they were, dozens of them, flying as if they owned our sky. In that instant, I realized the war was truly lost. Major James B. Tapp, who would later become an ace with 8 confirmed victories, was among the first Mustang pilots to engage a group of Japanese fighters. His combat report, written just hours after the mission, detailed the encounter with clear precision. They attacked us in the traditional 3-plane formation, but their coordination was lacking. The flight leader would make his move, but his wingmen often fell short. They seemed hesitant, possibly low on fuel or ammunition, or perhaps they were simply inexperienced. We dove through them with a speed advantage of 100 miles per hour, unleashed quick bursts, and climbed back to altitude before they could react. This breakdown in Japanese tactical coordination highlighted a crisis in pilot training that had reached disastrous levels. By 1945, most skilled Japanese pilots were dead. killed over the Solomons, New Guinea, the Philippines, or during the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Replacements received as few as 50 hours of flight training before being sent into combat, while American pilots got around 600 hours of training before entering combat areas. When the smoke cleared and the Mustangs returned to their base at Iwama, the Sunsetters of the 7th Fighter Command were credited with 26 Japanese planes destroyed, 1 probable, and 5 damaged. The American forces lost 2 P-51s and 1 pilot. The 13-to-1 kill ratio from this first mission would only improve as American pilots gained more experience over Japan, and the quality of Japanese pilots continued to decline. In just weeks, kill ratios of 20-to-1 or even 30-to-1 became common, showcasing not only American superiority but also Japanese desperation. The performance differences between the aircraft became glaringly obvious in combat, especially in the vertical domain where aerial combat was increasingly fought. The P-51D's capabilities stood out. Superiority was clear above 20,000 feet, the altitude for most interceptions. At these heights, the Merlin engine's 2-stage supercharger delivered sea-level power. Meanwhile, Japanese engines struggled due to the thin air. The first stage of the supercharger compressed the air. It cooled the air through an intercooler, then sent it to the second stage for even more compression, supplying dense, oxygen-rich air to the cylinders. The Ki-84's single-stage supercharger lacked an intercooler and a second stage. As a result, its power dropped significantly above 20,000 feet. This reduced its speed and climb rate just where interceptions often took place. At 30,000 feet, the Ki-84 could barely reach 350 miles per hour. In contrast, the P-51D could still achieve 420 miles per hour. Lieutenant Jerry Yellen of the 78th Fighter Squadron, who flew the last combat mission of the war on August 14, 1945 in the United States and August 15 in Japan, described a typical engagement vividly. He said they would spot enemy aircraft climbing to meet them, leaving dark exhaust trails as they pushed their throttles to the limit. But by 25,000 feet, the enemy planes struggled like fish out of water. Their engines were smoking, likely because they were running too rich due to insufficient air from their superchargers. American pilots would dive through their formation with their guns blazing. Tracers appeared like laser beams as the Japanese planes could not match their speed in the dive or the climb that followed. The Merlin engine would sing as they pulled up while the G-forces pressed them into their seats. Meanwhile, the Japanese radials would cough and sputter, fighting to maintain power. The P-51D could dive at speeds near 500 miles per hour while remaining in control. Its laminar flow wings worked well even in the transonic range. On the other hand, Japanese fighters often faced control reversal or structural failure when diving beyond 400 miles per hour. Their control surfaces would fizzle out or their wings might tear off. The gap in pilot quality was devastating and widened each day. American pilots arriving at Iwama typically had between 400 to 600 hours of flight time. This included over 100 hours on their specific planes, many hours of gunnery practice, and extensive combat training with experienced instructors. They trained using captured enemy aircraft and accurate simulations. They practiced formation flying to the point it became second nature, mastered instrument navigation in all types of weather, honed deflection shooting at towed targets, and refined combat tactics built on 3 years of air warfare experience. In 1945, Japanese pilots often had fewer than 100 flight hours. Some had as little as 30 hours. They received very little gunnery practice due to shortages of ammunition. There was no instrument training available. Combat tactics were learned from manuals rather than from experienced instructors, who were either dead or engaged in combat missions. The navigation challenges set apart the skilled pilots from those who were not likely to survive. Flying single-engine fighters on round trips over 1,100 meters of ocean with limited navigation aids required both confidence and considerable experience. American pilots were supported by detailed weather briefings. These briefings came from submarine reports and reconnaissance flights. They had accurate maps, updated from photo reconnaissance. Their instruments were made to precise standards. Rescue submarines were stationed along their routes. These submarines saved many downed airmen. If pilots had to land in the water, Dumbo PBY Catalina flying boats were ready to assist. In contrast, Japanese pilots often flew with outdated maps. These maps did not show recent bomb damage. Their compasses were unreliable and had not been calibrated correctly. If they went down over water, there was little hope of rescue. Their life rafts often leaked, and any emergency rations had typically been used up during food shortages. In 1945, the magnetic variation between Iwo and Tokyo was 3 degrees west. Tokyo was located between the 139th and 140th meridians, while Iwo was between the 141st and 142nd. This meant navigation could be simplified to basic compass headings for the return flight. This fortunate geographic coincidence saved many American lives when weather conditions worsened or when pilots became disoriented. If their compasses went haywire, a pilot could fly south-southeast and eventually see Mount Suribachi rising from the ocean, assuming he had enough fuel. The logistics behind each force showed the real nature of the Pacific Air War. It was a battle between American abundance and Japanese scarcity. Each mission from Iwo involved nearly 100 Mustangs. They consumed 57,000 gallons of high-octane fuel and carried 230,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, along with bombs and rockets for ground attacks. This was just one day's operations from one base. 3 fighter groups operated from Iwo Jima alone. Behind them was a supply chain reaching back to factories in Detroit, refineries in Texas, and ammunition plants in Missouri. Liberty ships were produced at a rate of 3 per day. C-54 Sky transport aircraft flew regular cargo routes across the Pacific. Ships arrived daily at Iwo Jima, unloading fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, mail, and many other items needed to maintain a modern air force. Meanwhile, Japanese logistics had fallen into chaos. Aviation fuel was so scarce that training flights were canceled. As a result, new pilots faced combat without recent flying experience. Ammunition was limited even during combat missions, with pilots instructed to conserve rounds for only the most certain shots. The Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces, rarely coordinated even in better times, now competed desperately for dwindling resources. They resembled starving dogs fighting over scraps. Aircraft were stripped for spare parts until they became mere aluminum skeletons. Entire fighter groups were grounded due to a lack of tires, spark plugs, or hydraulic fluid. Some units tried to make their own spare parts in primitive workshops, but the results were predictably poor. The technological gap went beyond the aircraft to every operational aspect. American pilots wore suits that prevented blackouts during high-G maneuvers by promoting blood flow to the brain. They used standardized oxygen systems that worked reliably above 30,000 feet with automatic flow regulation. Communication was conducted via VHF radios that offered clear reception and multiple channels. Their parachutes were regularly inspected and repacked. Life rafts contained functioning radios and fresh supplies, while their survival kits included items ranging from morphine to fishing gear. In contrast, Japanese pilots often flew without operational radios. Their vacuum tube radios drained precious battery power and rarely worked properly. They relied on faulty oxygen systems that frequently failed above 20,000 feet, causing hypoxia and disorientation. They lacked suits, which limited their ability to match American maneuvers without blacking out or suffering from broken blood vessels in their eyes. On June 1, 1945, a day known as Black Friday by the Mustang men, the weather proved to be a greater threat than enemy action, showing that even American technology had its limits. About 150 Mustangs heading to Osaka encountered a sudden weather front that was not predicted. In just minutes, 27 aircraft were lost, with 24 of those losses due to the weather. Pilots became disoriented in towering cumulus clouds. They collided with each other or ran out of fuel while searching for clear air. This event showed that even for the technologically advanced Americans, long-range missions pushed both pilots and machines to their limits. The weather front stretched from sea level to 40,000 feet. It brought violent turbulence, icing conditions, and zero visibility. Pilots reported seeing St. Elmo's fire dancing on their wings. Compasses spun uselessly, and artificial horizons tumbled as gyroscopes failed to keep up with the chaos. The effect on Japanese morale was devastating and permanent. Captain Yoshio Yoshida, an important pilot with the 47th Senti who survived the war, noted in his diary, "The sight of American fighters over Tokyo has shattered our confidence completely. We were led to believe that B-29 bombers were vulnerable without escorts and that their fighters could never reach us. Now, we see Mustangs over the palace, attacking our airfields in broad daylight and shooting down our best pilots as if they were beginners. How can we protect the Emperor when enemy fighters fly freely over our homeland?" The image of those confident, numerous Mustangs with their invasion stripes reveals what our leaders will not say. The war is lost, and we are only waiting to die. Major Tapp, in a post-war interview, described VLR missions as a true test of flying skill. Engaging with Japanese fighter pilots raised your adrenaline, but the most challenging part was simply getting from point A to point B. The ocean seemed endless and featureless, almost hypnotic. Pilots constantly checked their compasses, questioning if they were lost or turned around. The physical and mental strain built up over time. Pilots were strapped into their cockpits for 8 hours or more. They could not stand, stretch, or relieve themselves except through a tube that often froze at high altitude. They endured cramping legs, with pain that felt like needle pricks, and numb buttocks that made them wonder if they would ever walk again. Constant anxiety loomed as they flew a single-engine aircraft over vast, empty ocean, where one mechanical failure would likely mean certain death. The cockpit of the Mustang was designed based on 3 years of combat experience and countless pilot reports. It outperformed Japanese designs in every way. The P-51D had a bubble canopy that allowed for an impressive 360-degree view. Pilots could even turn their heads to look behind them, a crucial feature during combat. The seat could be adjusted for pilots of various heights. The rudder pedals were movable to suit different leg lengths. Controls were strategically placed to reduce fatigue during lengthy missions. The instrument panel was well organized, with essential gauges like airspeed, altitude, and engine indicators within easy view. In contrast, the cockpit of the Ki-84, while improved from earlier Japanese fighters like the Zero, still had significant drawbacks. It provided limited rear visibility due to structural elements and a fuel tank positioned behind the pilot's head. The controls were awkwardly arranged, forcing pilots to take their hands off the stick at critical moments. Instruments were often hard to read in combat, especially when piloting under high G-forces or dealing with engine vibrations. Armament differences proved critical in the outcomes of air combat. These differences often dictated life-or-death situations in fast-paced encounters. The P-51D featured 6 50-caliber machine guns. While they may have seemed less impressive than the Ki-84's mixed cannon setup, they brought significant advantages. American guns were incredibly reliable, with malfunction rates below 1% when properly maintained, thanks to dedicated arms specialists. The P-51D could carry 1,880 rounds, while the Ki-84 had just 400 rounds for its cannons and machine guns combined. This allowed American pilots to take shots at longer ranges, engage multiple targets, and avoid running out of ammunition quickly. The ballistics of the 50-caliber rounds were well understood. American pilots could consistently hit targets at 400 yards. Meanwhile, Japanese pilots with mixed cannon and machine gun armament faced challenges with convergence zones and varying ballistic trajectories. Their cannon rounds dropped differently than their machine gun rounds, complicating accurate shooting beyond close range. The training disparity in gunnery was even more evident. American pilots were better trained and prepared for combat challenges. They had fired thousands of rounds during training. They learned to lead targets and to estimate ranges. They practiced firing in short bursts to prevent their guns from overheating. They trained on towed sleeves, using camera guns, and engaged in mock dogfights until deflection shooting became second nature. In contrast, Japanese pilots in 1945 were lucky to fire even 100 rounds in training, if they got that much. Ammunition was too valuable to waste on training when it was needed for combat. Many entered their first combat experience without ever having fired their guns. They had to learn deflection shooting while someone was trying to take their lives. The last aerial combat of the Sunsetter took place near Tokyo on August 10, 1945. The 15th and 56th Fighter Groups claimed 7 kills that day. It marked one of the final air battles of World War II. By then, Japanese resistance had diminished significantly, becoming a mere shadow of the force that once dominated the Pacific. Fuel shortages grounded many Japanese fighters. Their fuel tanks were drained to supply kamikaze aircraft. Those who did manage to fly were often teenagers with limited training. Some had only been high school students a few months prior. In total, the Mustangs from the European Theater of Operations were credited with downing 206 Japanese airplanes from April to August 1945. This accounted for 75% of the aerial victories by the P-51s in the Pacific. The actual number may have been higher, as many Japanese aircraft shot down over Japan went unconfirmed. Their wrecks were often lost in forests or urban areas. The strategic impact was far-reaching, reshaping the entire Pacific War. The presence of P-51s over Japan allowed B-29 bombers to strike with greater accuracy during daylight. They systematically destroyed Japan's industrial infrastructure. Japanese production, already crippled by shortages and B-29 raids, came to a standstill due to this precise bombing. The psychological effects were also devastating. Japanese civilians watched American fighters strafing airfields in broad daylight. They attacked trains and shipping in Tokyo Bay, demonstrating that Japan had lost control of its airspace. The myth of the divine wind, which was believed to protect Japan, was shattered as American fighters flew over the imperial palace. Lieutenant Colonel John R. Morgan of the 457th Fighter Squadron carried out several photo reconnaissance missions over Japan. He flew a specially modified P-51D equipped with cameras instead of guns. His reports clearly showed the extent of the collapse of Japanese aviation. We would fly over airfields reported to have hundreds of aircraft. In reality, we would find maybe a dozen planes that were flyable. The rest were in ruins. Many had no engines or propellers. Some were just shells stripped for parts. They would move wrecks around to make it appear they had more operational aircraft for our photo interpreters, but we could tell the difference. Some airfields had fake wooden planes with painted markings. They were trying to divert our attacks from real aircraft hidden in protective shelters or covered up. The industrial numbers told a clear story of the war. The United States produced 15,586 P-51s during the conflict, which was more than Japan's total aircraft production in 1944 and 1945 combined. Japan produced about 3,500 Ki-84s, but many were destroyed on the ground by B-29 raids and carrier attacks. Others were lost in training accidents due to poor quality control or were grounded because of part shortages. As Japanese production fell, American production surged. North American aviation alone was making 20 P-51s per day at peak production, which was more than Japan's output of Ki-84s in an entire month. Each American aircraft was nearly identical with interchangeable parts. In contrast, Japanese aircraft varied greatly in quality and performance, even within the same batch. The training pipeline showed a similar overwhelming advantage for the United States. By 1945, the United States was training 30,000 pilots each year. Each pilot received 200 to 300 hours of flight training before moving on to advanced fighter training, followed by an additional 100 hours of combat training. Japan's pilot training program had nearly collapsed. New pilots received perhaps 50 hours of instruction before joining operational units, often even less. The numbers regarding attrition made it clear. The United States could replace lost pilots while maintaining high standards. Japan could not, even with greatly reduced standards. For every pilot Japan trained, the United States trained 10, and the American pilots were much better prepared. Fuel consumption painted a striking picture of the strategic outcome. Each P-51 mission from Iwima consumed around 600 gallons of 100-octane fuel per aircraft, including internal fuel and drop tanks. With 100 aircraft per mission and daily operations, that meant 60,000 gallons per day for just one fighter group. American tankers supplied this need. Millions of gallons of fuel flowed monthly to bases in the Pacific. This created a steady supply of fuel being transported across the ocean. In contrast, Japan tried to produce aviation fuel from pine roots. It took 200 pine stumps to create just 1 gallon of barely usable fuel. They even converted training aircraft into kamikaze weapons because they lacked the fuel for traditional operations. By August 1945, Japan had less than 200,000 gallons of aviation fuel left in the home islands. This was only enough for one major operation. The P-51D was more than just an impressive aircraft. It represented a revolutionary change in warfare. The aircraft showcased American industrial principles, including mass production, quality control, and standardization across producers. There was also a focus on continuous improvement based on combat experiences. Every P-51D produced was nearly identical. They had interchangeable parts and reliable performance. A pilot could easily get into any P-51D and know exactly how it would handle and where each switch and instrument was located. On the other hand, Japanese aircraft were increasingly handmade with varying material quality. As a result, they often showed inconsistent performance even among planes from the same production batch. One aircraft might reach 400 miles per hour, while another from the same factory might struggle to hit 350 miles per hour due to these manufacturing inconsistencies. Brigadier General Ernest M. Moore, who led the 7th Fighter Command, later stated, "I don't believe there is any question about the P-51 being the best prop fighter of World War II. He recognized it as the top air fighter for escort missions and noted it matched the P-47 when attacking ground targets." This opinion took into account not just the aircraft's performance, but also its reliability and adaptability in extreme conditions. The P-51 could be refueled and rearmed in just 30 minutes. It could fly twice a day if necessary, and it operated well from rough coral runways that would have damaged more delicate planes. The maintenance statistics were impressive and highlighted another aspect of American superiority. P-51Ds in Iwo Jima maintained an operational rate above 80%, even in tough conditions. Volcanic dust affected everything, and salty air corroded aluminum. Facilities were minimal, so most maintenance work had to be done outdoors. Ground crews managed to change engines in 4 hours, using mobile cranes and streamlined procedures. Battle damage that would keep a Japanese fighter grounded for weeks could be fixed overnight, with prefabricated parts flown in from the United States. The key to the aircraft, even when fuel and ammunition were available, had serviceability rates of less than 40%. Sometimes it dropped as low as 20%. The complex Humar engine required specialized tools that were often unavailable. Most trained technicians were either dead or drafted into combat units. Spare parts often had to be hand-fitted due to poor manufacturing tolerances. Weather reconnaissance provided another major advantage that saved countless American lives. Dedicated B-29 aircraft flew weather missions hours before fighter operations. They reported on cloud conditions, wind speeds, and frontal systems. These weather aircraft provided detailed meteorological data for planning routes that avoided serious weather. However, as Black Friday demonstrated, weather could still catch even the best prepared missions off guard. Japanese forces, lacking similar capabilities, often flew blindly into weather that destroyed entire formations. The American ability to predict and avoid weather fronts greatly reduced operational losses. In contrast, Japanese units faced catastrophic weather-related losses that surpassed combat casualties. The communication infrastructure supporting American operations was groundbreaking for its time. High-frequency radio beacons transmitted from submarines and island bases. Submarine-based rescue coordination directed search aircraft to downed pilots, and real-time weather updates created a safety network. This network gave pilots the confidence to push their aircraft to the limit. The psychological benefit of knowing that someone would search for you if you went down cannot be overstated. Japanese pilots often flew without functioning radios and without hope of rescue if they were forced down. They faced each mission with a fatalistic acceptance of likely death. Their farewell ceremonies before missions were serious. They expected not to return. Captain Harry Krim Jr. of the 531st Fighter Squadron, who would later become an ace over Japan with 7 victories, observed the strategic reality with brutal honesty. We owned the sky over Japan. We could go wherever we wanted and whenever we wanted. The Japanese knew this. We knew it. Most importantly, Japanese civilians knew it too. Every P-51 over Tokyo was proof that Japan had lost the war. We were no longer fighting for air superiority. We had already achieved it. We were simply proving a point. We showed them that resistance was useless. The long-range missions changed the strategic landscape in the Pacific. They made all previous plans irrelevant. Japan could no longer rely on distance for protection. The vast distances that had safeguarded them for centuries were no longer effective. The industrial region that had remained mostly unharmed during 3 years of war was now facing daily assaults. The sight of American fighters over Tokyo destroyed any remaining belief in Japan's ability to defend itself. It shattered the myth of the divine wind and highlighted that defeat was not just a possibility, but an inevitability. The human toll revealed the stark differences in technology in harsh numerical terms. Between July 1st and August 15th in 1945, 85 American fighter pilots lost their lives on very long-range missions. However, only a few were lost in air-to-air combat, maybe 5 or 6. Most losses came from operational issues, such as weather, mechanical failures, navigation errors, or sheer exhaustion that led to critical mistakes. During the same time frame, Japanese pilot losses numbered in the hundreds, possibly over 1,000. Entire squadrons were destroyed in vain attempts to intercept American formations. The 47th Centi started April with 40 operational pilots. By August, they had just 3 left. The 244th Centi was completely obliterated, reformed with new pilots, and destroyed again. The final dogfights over Japan revealed the complete collapse of Japanese air power as an organized force. On August 14th, 1945, which was August 15th in Japan due to the time difference, Lieutenant Jerry Yellin flew what would become the last combat mission of the war. He took off from Iwima with his wingman, 19-year-old Second Lieutenant Philip Schlamberg. They launched an attack on airfields near Nagoya. The mission was planned before the news of Japan's surrender reached their base. The code word Utah, intended to recall them, never reached their radios. Yellin and Schlamberg strafed their targets and headed home, maneuvering into a cloud formation to escape anti-aircraft fire. When Yellin emerged from the clouds, Schlamberg was gone. He had been shot down by ground fire, marking the last American combat death of World War II. Even in defeat, as the war was ending and the Emperor had already recorded his surrender, Japanese anti-aircraft positions continued to fire. Desperate determination filled the air. However, Japanese fighters were significantly lacking. They had effectively ceased to function as a fighting force. They were grounded due to fuel shortages, a lack of pilots, or were simply destroyed. The facts of the air war were clear and undeniable. They were written in aluminum and blood across Japan's skies. The P-51D Mustang, boasting a top speed of 440 miles per hour, a range of 2,000 miles with drop tanks, and 6 dependable machine guns with almost 2,000 rounds of ammunition, left Japan's home islands vulnerable to daylight air assaults. The K-84 Hayate, despite its potential and brave pilots, lacked the numbers, reliability, and quality of pilots to provide an effective counter. It was not a battle between equals. The outcome was predetermined, influenced by factories in Detroit and oil fields in Texas, just as much as by the combat over Tokyo. American industrial power, represented by the impressive P-51 Mustang, accomplished what naval blockades and island hopping could not. It completely eliminated Japan's capability to guard its airspace. The B-29 bombers that dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki flew unescorted, not due to a lack of availability, but because none were necessary. Japanese fighter aircraft had been cleared from the skies, overwhelmed by the superior American technology, training, and production. Out of 3,514 K-84s produced, only one remains today. It is housed in the Chiran Peace Museum in Kagoshima, Japan, serving as a lonely reminder of Japan's desperate efforts to compete with American technological superiority. In contrast, hundreds of P-51 Mustangs exist in museums and private collections around the world. Many still take to the skies at air shows, their Merlin engines echoing the song of American industrial achievement more than 70 years after they first soared over Tokyo. The difference in surviving aircraft tells a powerful tale. American planes were designed to endure, carefully maintained, and prized as historical treasures. Japanese planes were built for immediate deployment, anticipated to be lost in battle, and seen as expendable. The shock that Japanese pilots felt when they faced P-51 Mustangs over Tokyo went beyond mere tactical surprise. It was the shocking realization that American industrial capability and technological progress had turned the once impossible into a routine matter. Single-engine fighters could conduct combat missions of 1,500 meters, arrive with enough fuel for 2 hours of fighting, and safely return to their bases. This was beyond what Japan could understand or manage. The P-51D Mustang soaring over Mount Fuji was more than just a plane. It symbolized American industrial strength, technological progress, and the harsh realities of total war. The lesson was brutal and unmistakable. In the realm of modern industrial warfare, superior technology combined with extensive production leads to victory. The P-51D Mustang showcased American industry at its finest. Over 15,000 aircraft were produced, all with high quality. They were piloted by well-trained airmen, supported by limitless logistics, and deployed with strategic accuracy. In contrast, Japan's K-84 Hayate, despite brave pilots and some occasional tactical wins, stood little chance. The appearance of American fighters over Tokyo highlighted the harsh truth of reality. This reality culminated in atomic bombings over Hiroshima and Nagasaki by B-29 bombers, which no longer required fighter protection since Japanese air power had been neutralized. The Mustangs accomplished their mission with cold efficiency. They showcased that distance could not provide safety, that industrial strength surpassed individual bravery, and that technological advantage, when effectively utilized, was unbeatable. The Japanese pilots who encountered them in those decisive months faced the toughest lesson of modern warfare. Bravery alone could not match the numbers from industrial production, technological progress, and logistical dominance. The P-51D Mustang over Tokyo demonstrated that the era of the samurai had passed. It was replaced by the age of the production line, superchargers, and long-range fighter escorts. The divine wind was subdued by science. The warrior spirit was overwhelmed by industrial power. The empire of the rising sun was eclipsed by airplanes made of aluminum and powered by steel engines.